Chapter 9 of our textbook covers the digestive system. We are going to be looking at sections 1 through 5. And we want to be able to define the functions of the digestive system, list what parts of the body make up the digestive system. We want to be able to describe where does digestion actually begin. And then we should be able to describe where and how the following molecules are absorbed during digestion, specifically water, lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins. So those are all going to be absorbed at different points throughout the process of digestion. And so you should be able to name the organ or part of the digestive system that does that for each of those. So just like all the body systems, let us start with the functions of the digestive system. And the digestive system really specializes in bringing things into the body, absorbing what can be used, and then getting rid of what can't be used. The digestive system is composed of a long, continuous, hollow tube called the gastrointestinal tract, or the GI tract. The hollow space at the center of the tube, this is where the food travels through the body, is called the lumen. And the different sections of the GI tract are responsible for the different functions of the digestive system. So ingestion, which is bringing food into the body. Mechanical digestion, breaking it down into small enough pieces to actually enter the GI tract. Chemical digestion, breaking it down into the molecular elements that could be absorbed by the body. Absorption, the act of actually bringing those nutrients into the cells or into the tissues of the body. And then finally, defecation, which is getting rid of the parts that the body couldn't absorb and use. So all of those functions are going to happen at different points along that GI tract. And in your outline for this lecture, I included a table that lists all of the functions, and you should be able to fill that table out with where they're occurring, at what point during the GI tract. And there's some overlap. So we're going to see mechanical digestion, for example, in more than one place. We're going to see chemical digestion in more than one place, absorption in more than one place. So you should be able to look at each of the organs of the digestive system. What is being absorbed there? What is being broken down there? Those are the types of questions that we'll be answering. Okay, so all of the tissues involved. While the GI tract is composed of several different parts, so we're going to see many different organs that specialize in all of those functions that I mentioned, the majority of those organs actually have the same basic tissue layers in common because their functions are so similar. So starting from the lumen, remember that space in between, the mucosa is the innermost layer. And this is a very thin layer of epithelial cells. So basically the same layer that we're seeing coat all of the other systems that we've looked at. The cardiovascular system had that endocardium, and that was a thin layer of epithelial cells. And this secretes a mucus, that's why we call it the mucosa. And that keeps the GI tract well lubricated. So it keeps food particles moving and also prevents damage to the cells. So not only do we have the layer of tissue, epithelial tissue itself, those epithelial tissues are also secreting a mucus to keep food moving through the GI tract. Second, we have the submucosa, which is a layer of connective tissue that contains blood vessels and nerves. This blood supply is what maintains the nutrient supply to the cells of the digestive system, but it's also picking up all the products of digestion to carry them to other parts of the body. And the nerves in this layer are important for communicating to the next layer, which is going to be our muscle layer, when food is present in the GI tract. So the nerves are sensing the presence of food so that it can tell the next layer, our muscularis layer, what to do. So the third layer is the muscularis layer, and this is a layer of smooth muscle tissue. Actually, 2 to 3 layers of smooth muscle tissue, which we'll see here in just a second. And remember, when we think of smooth muscle, we need to be thinking automatic nervous system. So the functioning of our GI tract is not something that we need to manually, we're not sitting there after we take a bite of a sandwich and saying, oh, I got to push this sandwich through my GI tract. That's being sensed by those nerves being sensed by those nerves, and then telling that smooth muscle tissue, telling the brain to stimulate the contraction of that smooth muscle tissue. And we'll come back to look at those muscle layers in more detail. And then lastly, we have the serosa around the outside. And this is another thin layer of epithelial cells supported by some connective tissue. And that keeps the GI tract in place in the body. As we probably felt as we're undergoing the process of digestion, sometimes the GI tract moves. We feel some of that as our stomach fills. It gets larger in size and then smaller again as things move out. And then as food is moved through our small and our large intestine, we can feel that moving. So that serosa layer keeps everything lubricated so that it's not rubbing up against anything else. This becomes, as an extreme example, becomes kind of important during pregnancy. So as we have not all of us, right? As a female might have a fetus growing, the uterus is going to be expanding in size and moving parts of the digestive system out of their normal location. And all those layers of serosa material is not only going to prevent them from rubbing up against each other and everything else, but it's also going to play a role in putting it all back where it's supposed to go after birth happens. Okay, so we're going to kind of pretend like the food is our character, and we're going to kind of tell the story of digestion. Food enters the body through the mouth, we know that, and into the oral cavity, and the teeth are responsible for mastication. And this is an example of mechanical digestion. It includes tearing, grinding, and crushing food into small enough pieces until it can enter the esophagus. Here in the mouth with the salivary glands, we have our first example of chemical digestion. There are 3 pairs of salivary glands: the sublingual, which is below the tongue, the submandibular, which is below the mandible, and the parotid, which is in front of our ears. And then saliva contains an enzyme called salivary amylase, and this breaks down starches into shorter chains of sugars. So while this is our first example of chemical digestion, it's not digesting everything. It's only digesting starches or breaking down starches into smaller sugars. And we start digestion here in the mouth because that process of cellular respiration, which is where we get all of our cells' energy, uses sugar. So this allows us to access the sugars first. So this is like accessing that really, really quick energy. Also found in the oral cavity will be the tongue, which is made of skeletal muscle. When we see skeletal muscle within the body, we think we have control over that. So that's going to be something that we are actually functioning right now. When I'm talking to you, I am controlling my tongue. The taste buds, in combination with our olfactory receptors in the nose, help to monitor the quality of food. And then once food has been moved around by the tongue and crushed and torn up by the teeth, now it's what we call a bolus. And the tongue moves the bolus to the back of the mouth to be swallowed, which is what's going to trigger our swallow reflex to the esophagus. When we swallow, our tongue moves the bolus from the mouth through the pharynx and into the esophagus. The pharynx is a shared pathway between both the digestive system and the respiratory system. So we'll see the pharynx again in the next chapter as well. And this is a voluntary movement. We know that the tongue is skeletal muscle, so that's under our control. But once it reaches the pharynx, we have sensory receptors there, nerves, that detect its presence, and then that will stimulate the involuntary swallow reflex. And the reflex causes the larynx, which contains the voice box, to push upward and causes the epiglottis to close off the entry to our respiratory system. Because this is a shared pathway, that means that anything going through the pharynx could potentially go down our GI tract into the esophagus or down the trachea into the respiratory system. And we probably know from experience that we don't want anything solid like food down in our lungs. So this swallow reflex is designed to keep any solid things from traveling down into our lungs. So once that is stimulated, here's my mouse, here it is, it will cause the larynx, containing the voice box, to be pushed upward, and this little flap here, the epiglottis, to cover up the trachea, and that will direct the bolus down into the esophagus. Pretty cool, huh? Once it has entered the esophagus, it will move through the esophagus and the rest of the GI tract through a process called peristalsis. And peristalsis are waves of smooth muscle contraction. Smooth muscle, think involuntary movement, automatic control. The presence of the bolus, the chewed up food, stretches the lumen of the esophagus, and this triggers the contraction of those of circular muscles in the region of the tube directly behind the bolus. So in most sections of the GI tract, we have 2 layers of smooth muscle. So that muscularis layer is actually 2 layers of smooth muscle. We have our circular muscles that surround the tube circularly, and then we have our longitudinal muscles that run in the perpendicular direction. And once that bolus is detected, the circular muscles are going to pinch behind the bolus, and the longitudinal muscles are going to open up in front of the bolus, allowing there to be more space in the lumen, and that's going to pinch that bolus all the way down the esophagus, or all the way through our small and large intestine, as we'll see as we move through. Kind of like if you're squeezing the toothpaste toward the end of the tube. It's called a peristaltic wave, because it's going to create this wave of pinching of the circular muscles behind the bolus and opening up the muscles in the front of the bolus. And that wave will push the bolus all the way through the esophagus until it's deposited into the stomach. And I will pick up with what happens, all the exciting things that happen in the stomach, in the next video.